Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I'd like to welcome you to this lecture on Greek philosophy. When we take a look at Greek philosophy, we have to keep in mind that Greek philosophy, which kind of created a lot of the intellectual foundations for the Western world, was basically grouped into three primary areas of interest or expertise. We have, of course, the field of mathematics, the study of religion, whether that be ethics or such concepts as the soul or the afterlife. And the last would be a rather complex term called cosmology, which refers to kind of the idea of the origins of the universe, the origins of the earth, and how the natural world came to be. And initially, the Greeks had this kind of philosophy of something we call the primary substances. The belief of the Greeks prior to the great age of Greek philosophy was that the primary substances made up all living things and all physical things. And those primary substances would be the substances of earth, wind, fire, and water. And so the Greeks believed that everything was made up of some part earth, some part water, some part wind, some part fire. And those concepts of those four elements went on to kind of represent different facets of the physical world. Fire represented change and growth. Water represented movement. Earth represented stability and tangibility. And lastly, wind represented kind of an ability, a self-motivation, if you will. Now, we break Greek philosophy up into two primary groups when it comes to the Greeks. We talk about the pre-Socratics, or the philosophers that came before Socrates, and we talk about the Socratics, or the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and basically people that came after, that were based on their ideas. The first philosopher of note and record is a Greek philosopher by the name of Thales. And Thales was quite an interesting guy. He lived in the city of Miletus. He focused on the primary substance of water initially, but went on to kind of define what he considered to be, unseen or theoretical, or they were theoretical concepts. The first principle that he discovered was the principle of magnetism. He went so far as to even create the first magnet. And Thales also kind of delved into the realm of religion in that he kind of combined religion and science and argued that there was a scientific reason for the belief in the existence of the soul. Excuse me. I do apologize. See, Thales argued that it was a circular argument to say that something is alive because it's alive or something is dead because it's dead. Rather, in fact, he said that there must be some kind of physical principle that is the determination between life and death. And he argued that this physical principle was, in fact, the psyche, or that's Greek, for the English word soul. And Thales argued, that when the soul left the body, that was the actual physical change that produced unlife or death. And so he argued that while things were physical and they could be made up of many different elements, it was this principle of the soul of the psyche that actually made something alive, and the lack of that psyche would make something dead. A little bit later was Pythagoras. Now, most people know Pythagoras as a pure mathematician. Of course, he theoretically proved the principle of a squared plus b squared equals c squared. But the big key to Pythagoras, and in reality, the big key to the Greeks in general, is that they took subjects that were ordinarily grounded in the physical or in the world of application, and they took these mathematical principles, geometric principles, etc., they took them into a purely theoretical perspective. And when they did that, they wound up creating what we call theoretical mathematics, which has since given rise to such ideas as physics and quantum mechanics and things like that. Ideas and fields of study that kind of transcend the normal kind of expectations and bounds of applicable science. And so Pythagoras, while he was a great renowned mathematician, he was also a spiritual leader in the sense that Pythagoras argued that through the study of math, one could attain a higher understanding of the universe and in fact reach a kind of religious experience he called a catharsis that would lead one to higher spiritual enlightenment. Probably the most interesting and obviously I think the most bizarre Greek philosopher is a guy by the name of Parmenides. Now Parmenides, 515 to 450, Parmenides argued that the world we live in was in fact an illusion, that it was unreal. He argued, in fact, that there could not be such concepts as motion or as change and growth. And so he argued against a reality where those things were possible. Instead, he argued that all things were static and that we were basically not growing old, we were not born, we would not die, that everything was, in fact, locked into a kind of a status of stasis, and that everything that we perceived around us that indicated movement, change, or death, everything around us was in fact an illusion created by our minds. Like I said, I told you he's way out there. But one of the arguments that he used to kind of prove this was he went to the absurd argument of saying that if you take a given distance and you have that distance infinitely, you wind up with an infinite number of halves that make up a distance. And he said that theoretically one could not cross an infinite number of halves, meaning therefore that all motion was in fact impossible. Like I said, he was kind of out there. The last great pre-Socratic that I want to mention and talk about is a group, or it's actually a philosopher who started a group called the Atomists. His name is Democritus. And Democritus argued, in fact, that the theory of the primary substances was wrong, and that, in fact, everything was made up of something he called atoms. And that's where we get the term the atomist school. Excuse me. And he argued, in fact, that these atoms made up everything, and they were supercharged with energy and motion, and that as they sped around, they would collide with each other, and when they collided, they would actually make new compounds, which we kind of describe as molecules. And so our whole idea of the universe that we use today, an atomic theory of the universe, was actually created first by Democritus in the 4th century BCE. Even though he didn't have any kind of microscopes or any kind of technology to help him, he is the first individual to actually think up and kind of argue that there are in fact atoms that can't be seen, and that everything is made up of a combination of these different atoms, which, if you study science, you know, is kind of our basic understanding of the universe. Now, when we shift to group number 2, what we see actually the starting of what we call the Socratics. And it starts, of course, with the figure of Socrates. Now, Socrates kind of broke the mold from these earlier Greek philosophers in that he argued not about the origins of the universe or even mathematics, but he thought that the philosophia, as the Greeks called it, the love of wisdom, that it should focus upon humanity and human action. And so in response to that, he created the idea system or the ideological system that we call ethics. Socrates, who lived in Athens from 469 to 399, Socrates basically argued that the core foundation of human understanding and action should derive from basic, fundamental, absolute principles. Excuse me. And this argument then is kind of how he based his style of teaching that we call the Socratic method and dialogue. Socrates would basically ask you a question and have you take a ethical stance. And then he would then ask, why do you believe that, or what are the reasons for your belief? And he would keep kind of digging through questions at the core foundational principle that all of your decisions were based off of. And if that core foundational principle was not something you could identify, or was not something that could be considered to be an absolute principle, which means it was right or it was correct in all circumstances, then he would argue that everything that you built on top of that philosophy, that principle, would in fact be built on an unstable foundation, leading to problems. Socrates spent his entire life basically engaging in this dialogue with his students and with the people of Athens, particularly the government. And eventually in the year 399, that's actually where the problem started. Socrates was arrested for teaching young people in terms of the Greek law. He corrupted the youth, but he was actually teaching them to question authority and to question people's actions. And in the atmosphere of 399, which if you remember from our previous lecture about Greek history, that was right after the Peloponnesian War. It was right after Athens had been taken over by Sparta and a new government created. And that new government did not like the idea of Socrates basically teaching young men of wealth, because if you had the time to sit and listen to Socrates, you weren't poor. They didn't like the idea of Socrates teaching young males the idea that they should question authority. And as a result, he was basically arrested by the government. He was given three options. He was given the option to quit teaching, and they would release him. He could leave Athens. He could teach at another city-state, but he had to leave Athens. And the third choice they gave him was, in fact, execution. He could drink poison and die. And a lot of times I've heard students say they don't understand why he would have chosen the third option, which is what he chose. But I think the bigger question to ask is, if you've lived your entire life based upon a philosophy and based upon a dedication to the belief that one needs to make the right choices and has analyzed the reasons for those choices, then if you, at the end of the day, decide to go against that principle, then pretty much you've almost negated your entire life work. And I think if Socrates had chosen to give in and had chosen to basically compromise his principles, we probably would not be speaking of him today. Be that as it may, the death of Socrates gave rise to Socrates' pupil, named Plato. And Plato is another interesting guy, because Plato kind of merged the ideas of Socrates with the ideas of Parmenides. And so Plato argued that basically everything is based upon the belief that we exist in a world of shadow, which he called the world we live in. He said that the one true world was in fact a world of form, where everything was perfect and unchanging. And again, I use that word perfect particularly for a meaning. If something is perfect, then it cannot change, because one cannot, if you think about the word perfect theoretically, then that means one cannot become perfect, because if you can become perfect, you can unbecome perfect, which would be a flaw. And then you would, in fact, not be perfect. And so Plato's argument was that perfection could only exist in a static, unchanging world. And he argued that that is the world that exists behind the real world. And he gave the metaphor, or what we call the allegory, of the cave. And he argued that humans are locked in a cave, looking at shadows on the back wall of the cave of the real forms outside. And he argued that's how we can gain knowledge. We don't gain new knowledge, but in fact we remember old knowledge from the world of forms that we lived in before we were born. And that's why he argued that we can take a look at something that we might define as a chair, even though it can be many different shapes and sizes and different styles. but our mind always identifies that object as a chair because it basically reminds us of the only chair in existence that was in the world of forms. And I know that's kind of complicated and kind of weird, but that's the way that Plato kind of defined everything. He said that there was always one perfect example of everything, including, and this is interesting, he argued that also applied to a concept of a supreme being. And so he argued, contrary to his fellow Greeks, he argued that there could only be one God. And that one God did not exist in our reality, but existed in that world of form. He also argued that the purpose of humanity was to create, as close as they could, a just state. But he argued that the only ruler that could create a just state was a philosopher. Not surprising, given that he was a philosopher. But the reason why he targeted government was because he felt that the Athenian government in 399 had actually betrayed humanity by killing Socrates, who Plato considered to be the most just and the most educated and the most knowledgeable human. Not to be outdone, Plato also created a whole group of students, all his own, and one of his students became also extremely popular and very famous, and that student was known by the name of Aristotle. Aristotle disagreed with Socrates. He disagreed primarily with Socrates on two main points. He argued, in fact, that form was not static, that it was not universal, but in fact that it changed. And that, in fact, he argued that what something was made out of, matter, i.e., today we would call that its atoms, was in fact unchangeable. So basically, Aristotle argued that you can take a rock and you can shape that rock into a statue, which means you've changed its form. And then you could take that same statue and pound it with a sledgehammer and reduce it to rubble, and you would, in fact, again change its form, but at the same time, through all three of those states, it would remain the same rock. He argued that was the nature of all reality, and he called this doctrine of reality the ideas of form and matter. Now, what's interesting is that Aristotle's ideas of form and matter went completely unchallenged for more than 2,000 years. In fact, the person who challenged Aristotle is probably a name that everybody's heard of. That guy, in fact, was Albert Einstein. And the famous theory is called the theory of relativity, otherwise known as E equals mc squared. And the idea behind E equals mc squared is, in fact, that energy equals matter times the speed of light. And that idea then implies that matter is not universal, it's not unchanging, but in fact it can undergo change into energy. And that's why that theory was so important. Not that we can prove it or that it makes a lot of sense to us, but in fact it was the first attempt of someone in over 2,000 years of Western thought to challenge the ideas of Aristotle. Aristotle went on to focus on nature. He created the field of biology. He tried to classify living things into lots of different categories. And last but not least, probably the only similarity that he shared with Plato is his dedicated belief about the need for a philosopher king. And to that end, Aristotle left his teaching and went and tutored Alexander the Great in the hopes of creating that philosopher king. Now, while we know that attempt didn't succeed 100%, it does give an indication of how dedicated Aristotle was to this belief that we needed to create a just government and to create a philosopher king to run that just government. Well, it's going a little bit long, so we'll go ahead and stop there. This is just a brief introduction. If you have more questions, please email me. You can also do additional readings through the online resource materials if you wish. But this is just kind of an introduction to some of the fundamental principles of Western thought and how they kind of evolved and came from the Greeks and their Greek philosophy. Once again, I thank you for listening to the lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thank you.